Let's talk about some expectations. What's reasonable? There's some major programs out there with some big-time expectations. Preview magazine season is upon us, so a lot of folks are going to say a lot of very bold things. But I want to know what's reasonable. And so tonight, I'm going to go down the list. We're going to start with Texas A&M, and I'm going to throw some teams out there. And before I tell you what I think about them, I want you to just shout right back at me, whether you're driving around on a Tuesday morning listening to the podcast or whether you're watching live. What do you think is reasonable to expect? What should these fan bases feel confident in expecting? Texas A&M. What do you think we should expect from the Aggies this year? 2021, last year, you saw they had some ups, they had some downs. They lost a quarterback. They beat Alabama. And so they were 8-4 last year. The bowl game got canceled on them. Their over-under win total, and this is kind of where I want to start and pivot off of all these teams. The over-under is 8.5, and it's heavily juiced to the over. So we may even see that thing hit 9 before the season kicks off. So with that in mind, what do you think a reasonable expectation is in terms of wins and losses for a Texas A&M fan? You know where I went? I went 10-2. I went a game and a half above the over-under win total. Here's where my mind's at. There's this in-between vibe amongst most of the college football public, it seems, including Vegas, with Texas A&M. The in-between meaning everyone's on fire right now about what they're doing in terms of recruiting and NIL, and we got a bunch of talent that's on campus, but I don't know if anyone stopped to look around. A lot of talent's been on campus. Over the past 4 recruiting cycles, you know what their average class finish has been? 4.75. They've averaged a top 5 finish. They're loaded. If we were to look at this roster and Nick Saban were the coach, if we looked at that roster and Kirby Smart was the coach, no one would sit around saying, let's just get us 9 wins this year. No, rightfully so. The expectation would be that team right there, with a roster that loaded, 4 consecutive classes inside the top 8, they need to be competing for the SEC championship. Why should I think any differently about Texas A&M? Just because it's become this going narrative that they're 1 year away. Jimbo Fisher's been there 5 years. It's his 5th year now. They've recruited at a top elite level. Why wouldn't I expect them to be in contention? Just because someone said they shouldn't be? I don't think so. I mean, we're talking about Max Johnson and Haynes King at quarterback. We just brought in the number 1 receiver in the country. We brought in like 70 of the top defensive linemen in the country out there. They've got everything they need, and then some, to compete. You know what has to happen? The staff out there has to get it done. People have to execute. You've got to beat some really good teams. You're looking at their schedule right now if you're watching on YouTube. The way I see it is they play Alabama. That's a Tier 1 game. Playing at Alabama is a Tier 1 game. I would not expect any team in America to win the game. It's not impossible. I don't expect it. But outside of that, when you talk about their Tier 2 games, you can look at Miami coming in there. You can look at Florida, LSU. All of those teams have new staffs. The game against Arkansas is in Dallas. Those Tier 2 games are very winnable. They get Florida at home late in the year. They get Ole Miss at home later in the year. So, yeah, 10-2 I think is more than reasonable for you to expect as a Texas A&M fan. And if you finish below that, see, there's this real interesting world here where you could finish below 10 wins, but you could hit the over, 8.5, and land at 9, and I really don't think much of anyone would be happy in that particular point. But the good news is this is not a make-or-break year. They still have several years they're building towards in the future. I just don't think we should have to wait for 2023 for Texas A&M to compete for this thing. That's all I'm saying. Next up, let's go all the way across the country to the West Coast. The Oregon Ducks finished 22nd last year, 10-4. As you well know by now, Mario Cristobal out the door. Dan Lanning, defensive coordinator at Georgia, he heads out west. When you dive into their schedule, it's a lot tougher than it seems. Their over-under win total's 9. Okay, so I want to preface everything I'm about to say with that. And it's pretty evenly juiced, minus 115 either way if you're looking at Caesars right now. They're plus 300 to win the Pac-12. They're plus 6,000 to win the national championship. But I'm going to go back to what we should expect reasonably in terms of a win-loss. I put Oregon at 9-3. I think it's reasonable to expect 9-3. And you may think, oh boy, Oregon, you know, they've got a pretty loaded roster. They've got Bo Nix coming in there via the transfer market. So they're not a huge question mark at quarterback. Mario left behind a really, really good stable of talent. Don't you expect them to be better than that? Well, it's all relative. You are You are not always what your record says you are in this sport because of, as we often talk about, the dichotomy, the vast gulf between strengths of schedules. And the fact is, Oregon has a sneaky tough schedule. I know a lot of people laugh at that in the South. I'm just saying, if you look right now, if you're watching on YouTube, you see it. They open against Georgia. They're over a 2-touchdown underdog there. But that's not this thing where they start tough and then it greatly eases up the rest of the way. They won't play another Georgia in the regular season, I'll grant you that. But look who they play in week 3. First off, let me state Eastern Washington in week 2 is one of the tougher FCS teams you can play. But I think most of us expect them to win the game. They got Brigham Young coming in there in week 3. We're going to talk about BYU a little bit later on. Ooh, there it went. There went that Y there. We're going to talk about Brigham Young a little bit later on. In fact, we're going to talk about 2 teams back-to-back here. Brigham Young and Washington State that have 2 of the most underrated quarterbacks in America. And the reason I'm bringing up the quarterback position is because one of the great areas of at least concern, if you don't want to call it a weakness, is secondary. They got some guys coming in there into Oregon via the transfer market that have to pan out. And as you see, they're playing Georgia, Brigham Young, and Washington State, 3 of the first 4 games of the season. Georgia's got the most loaded wide receiver stable I think they've had in quite a while. It's going to be tough. That's going to be sort of a baptism by fire for that Oregon secondary early on. And so I keep going down that list. They get UCLA at home. They get Utah at home. But new staff, new quarterback, a lot of expectation there. People do not expect things to drop off in terms of production standpoint, even if they do have Dan Lanning. And look, I'm optimistic they're going to be a good team this year. That is how much I think their schedule is a challenge. So I went 9-3. And if you wanted to argue with me that a more reasonable expectation would be 8-4, I don't think I'd push back all that hard. There is, of course, a path where they exceed all of this. We're talking about reasonable, not best case. We're talking about reasonable. I think 9-3 is a slightly aggressive, reasonable expectation for Oregon. Now let's head to the SEC. Let's stay in the state that I sit in right now. It was a bad day on the diamond, but let's look ahead to the gridiron this fall. Tennessee, coming off a 7-6 year, depending on how you want to count that bowl game against Purdue, 7-6. Yes, we have to statistically count it as a loss. I broke Tennessee's schedule down into 3 tiers. Their over-under win total, 7.5 coming into the year. So they won 7 last year. Vegas has their over-under 7.5 juiced towards the over. So probably a little bit heavier action on the over right now. I got them with 2 games in Tier 1. They play Alabama and Georgia. They play them every year. One of the only teams to play both of them every year. Those are Tier 1 games. It's not reasonable to expect them to win. It's hopeful, but it's not reasonable. So let's call those games 0-2 to be reasonable. And then let's move on to Tier 2, because Tier 2 is where they have to make some noise in order to hit what I think is reasonable for Tennessee, and that's a 9-3 record this year. And if Tennessee's going to be 9-3 this year, when we look at games at Pitt, Florida at home, at LSU, Kentucky at home, and at South Carolina, I need them to be 4-1 there. If they don't upset Georgia or Bama, I need them to be 4-1 out of those games. Pitt, Florida, LSU, Kentucky, and South Carolina, and then they need to sweep Tier 3. Can't be getting upset by Missouri, can't go to Vanderbilt and lay an egg, so got to be perfect there. If they drop both of those Tier 1 games, but they can go 4-1, which I think they're very capable of, in Tier 2, that's a 9-3 record. Now, is that a little aggressive? I think it is a little aggressive. I told you at the outset, I'm going to be a little aggressive with this, but we will not have to wait too long. This is not Michigan's schedule. Michigan hardly plays anyone with a pulse the first month of the season, so we're going to wait a little while before we get to see the real Michigan this year. With Tennessee, they go to Pitt. ACC champs a year ago. They go to Pitt in week 2. Pitt beat them last year in Knoxville. They go to Pittsburgh in week 2. Then they've got Florida coming in there in week 4 at home. Think about how different September could be. It's kind of got a Penn State 2021 vibe. They have so many hinge games in the first weeks of the season. We're going to know a whole lot about, obviously, whether this is realistic or more idealistic. They play at Pitt and they play Florida, and that's before we get to October. There's no reason why Tennessee should start slow this year. They return a quarterback that was a 34-3 touchdown to INT guy last year. There's a lot of continuity here. There's a lot of last year carryover into this year. I expect that there will be some folks who look at 9 wins and say, still think you're a year away. I don't think it's the most aggressive, reasonable expectation in the world to call 9-3 on Tennessee. Let's go down south to Miami. We were going to do Florida State here, but I'm talking about FSU a little bit later on. So let's talk Miami here. I was on a seesaw for like an hour. I spent an inordinate amount of time on my Miami reasonable expectation earlier today because I was on 8-4 for a little while. And I'll tell you where I wound up. So they were sitting as of airtime at 8.5 over under preseason win total. So that's pretty aggressive. They got a new coaching staff in there. Mario Cristobal's in, out with Manny Diaz. You know all that. So here we go. I was on 8-4. I ended up bumping my reasonable expectation from Miami up to 9-3. They do not have a ton of game breakers at receiver. That's a negative. They've got guys they think they can depend on, but they don't have game breakers there. But here's the positive as we start to look at their schedule. They've got, I think, a dependable commodity in Tyler Van Dyke at quarterback. Could be great, but at the very least, I'm going to call him dependable. Good decisions last year, didn't throw the ball to the other team a whole lot, didn't turn it over a whole lot, but they also have a very dependable, I think, stable of running backs. They return, I think, 3 along the offensive line. They feel good about where they're going to be on the offensive line. They brought in a head coach who specializes on the offensive line. They have got dynamite special teams coming back. So my point is, I just built you several pillars of this team, offense and special teams at least, that I think can be dependable. Those have carryover effect. Those are there week after week. And the reason why I mentioned the wide receiver position at the front of that as being something that lacks game breakers is when you look at their schedule, they don't even look at the game at A&M. If you want to chalk that one up as a loss, go ahead. That's fine. It's going to be a single-digit point spread. It's already out. But if you want to chalk that one up as a loss, that's fine. But North Carolina, at Virginia Tech, at Virginia, Florida State, at Clemson, Pitt, those just scream to me multiple one-possession games in here. So if you can give me dependability at quarterback and good decision-making, a solid run game, solid offensive line, good special teams play, it's enough to tilt me the other way. And I'm not telling you they're going undefeated. I'm giving them a cushion to have 3 losses. But I think they can navigate that schedule at a 9-3 clip. And then we start to see how the on-field product impacts the off-the-field recruiting product. But 9-3, that's where I landed with Miami. And last but not least for tonight is Michigan. I was on 9-3 a long time with Michigan too. Guess I seesawed on this one. I'll tell you what changed in a second. Famously, they went to the playoff last year. They beat Ohio State. They won the Big Ten. They went to the playoff, and then we had all the off-field stuff with Jim Harbaugh. He's back, got 2 new coordinators, so that's essentially what you missed if you've been tuned out over the last 5 or 6 months. Over-under preseason win total for Michigan is 9.5, evenly juiced. That's a very high number, very high number. They're coming off doing a lot of things they had not done under Jim Harbaugh. That factors into this equation. But at the same time, I think about it, and I always think about follow-up performances. And I so often, maybe it's a negative way to look at things, but I so often have recollection of folks who did not follow up with a sophomore performance, if you will, off of a historic performance the year before, and history's just littered with them. And so my natural tendency, when you see 2 coordinators leave and a not quite generational, but a really, really good pass rusher leave, is to just think you're going to take a step back. I think that's human nature, to think that that's going to happen. And then you had Harbaugh try and get out to the NFL and come back, and whether folks around the program expect that to be a factor or not, it's at least there in your mind. Well, I've talked to some Michigan buddies, and I'm not talking about ill-informed people either, people who have a really good pulse and read of the program. And, the more I talk to them, they made this point. They look at the Ohio State game at the end of the year, and they say, listen, we're always going to have hope that we can beat Ohio State, but if the outside world wants to assume we're going to lose that game, fine. Assume it. There's 1 loss already. Their quote pretty much to me has been, even if we're going to lose to Ohio State, we have no business coming into Columbus, Ohio at 9-2 or worse. So what they're saying is, look, I'm going to call us 10-2, and that's going to be what I give Michigan here. I think 10-2 is a reasonable expectation. They may lose to Ohio State. And for all I know, they're going to drop it by 50, or maybe they beat them. But my point is, even if they lose that game, is it reasonable to expect them to lose 2 other games before that? I don't think so. I'm looking around the schedule. The first month of the season, they'll be heavily favored. But then they go to Iowa and to Indiana. I know it's not the easiest place to play on the road at Kinnick Stadium. They're better than Iowa. They should beat Iowa. They're better than Penn State at home. They should beat Penn State at home. Not by 50, but they should beat Penn State at home. Ditto with Michigan State. There's a lot of should that's happening, on paper. I understand where the football games are actually played. But Michigan's roster is such that they can afford to lose an impact player or two. When I look at guys returning like Corum or Donovan Edwards, really good stable of running backs. Both quarterbacks return. Ronnie Bell's back from injury at wide receiver, and they've got a pretty good stable of receivers there. Certainly when you look at the overall athleticism in the receiver room, it's continued to upgrade. It's not where Ohio State's is. Newsflash, no one's room is where Ohio State's is. But even if we're not going to compare them to the Buckeyes, elsewhere in the Big Ten, that's what I'm talking about, where are the two other losses? I see losable games, but I think it's reasonable to expect them to be able to navigate the rest of that schedule with no more than one regular season loss. So I'm going 10-2 with Michigan. Those are reasonable, in my mind, expectations for this year. We're going to do several more teams because I kind of like the way that went. So we'll do several more teams, but in the meantime, what did I give you? I gave you A&M, Oregon, Tennessee, Miami, Michigan. Feel free in the comment section to give me reasonable, it's a key word there, reasonable expectations in your mind for those teams. Just pretend you're running a sports book. What would you set the number at, I guess?